A duke saw a widow living alone in an old snow cabin. What he did that day will amaze you. The blizzard hit the Scottish Highlands like the wrath of an angry god. Duke Alistair Blackwood pressed his face against the carriage window, watching the world disappear into white chaos. Snow fell so thick and fast it looked like the sky itself was tearing apart, each flake a piece of heaven crashing to earth. "Your Grace," his driver shouted over the howling wind, "we need to turn back. The road ahead is impossible." Before Alistair could respond, the carriage lurched violently to the left. He felt the sickening sensation of wheels losing purchase on ice, the momentum carrying them sideways even as the horses screamed and fought against their harnesses. Then they were sliding, tumbling down an embankment in a chaos of splintering wood and terrified animals. When the world finally stopped moving, Alistair found himself half buried in a snowdrift, his expensive coat torn, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. The carriage lay on its side 20 feet away, one wheel still spinning uselessly. "Thomas," he called for his driver, but the wind tore the words away before they could travel. Alistair pulled himself from the snow, his entire body aching. The cold was immediate and vicious, cutting through his layers like they were paper. He needed shelter. Now. Through the swirling white, he spotted something. A flicker of orange light, barely visible through the pine trees. Warmth. Shelter. Survival. He stumbled toward it, his fine boots sinking deep into snow with each step. His hands were already numb, his face burning with cold. The light seemed impossibly far away, a beacon that kept retreating with each painful step forward. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he reached it. A cabin. If it could even be called that. The structure was so dilapidated it looked like a strong wind might finish what time had started. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, half the shutters hung at broken angles, and the entire building seemed to lean slightly to the left, as though exhausted by the effort of standing. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, and light glowing weakly through gaps in the shutters, and right now that was all that mattered. Alistair hammered on the door with frostbitten fists. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside, cautious footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being moved. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and eyes that had seen too much hardship. Her face was thin, gaunt even, but there was a dignity in the way she held herself that spoke of pride that no amount of poverty could diminish. "Please," Alistair managed through chattering teeth. "My carriage crashed. I need shelter from the storm." The woman studied him for a moment that felt endless. Alistair was used to being recognized, to the particular way people's eyes widened when they realized they were speaking to the Duke of Blackwood, one of the wealthiest men in Scotland. But this woman just saw a cold traveler. She opened the door wider, stepping back. "Come in quickly. You're letting the heat out." What heat, Alistair thought as he stepped inside, but he was grateful anyway. The cabin's interior was barely warmer than outside. One small room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all at once. The furniture was sparse: a narrow bed in one corner, a rough table with a single chair, a few shelves holding meager supplies. And in the fireplace, burning desperately, were the legs of what had once been a chair. The woman was burning her furniture to stay warm. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a stool near the fire. "You need to warm up slowly or you'll go into shock." Alistair obeyed, too cold to argue. He watched as the woman moved around the tiny space with practiced efficiency. She was wearing 3 layers of wool, he noticed, all of them patched and worn thin. Her hands were rough with work, her feet wrapped in cloth instead of proper boots. She poured hot water from a kettle into a chipped cup, added what looked like a pinch of tea leaves, and handed it to him. "Thank you," Alistair said, wrapping his frozen hands around the warmth. "Don't thank me yet," the woman said with a ghost of a smile. "The tea is weak and the company is poor. The company saved my life." Alistair took a sip. The tea was indeed weak, barely colored water with a hint of flavor. But it was hot, and right now that was enough. Cold, exhausted, and lucky to be alive, the woman interrupted. That's all I need to know. Names can wait until you're warm. She moved to the small stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. When she handed it to him, Alistair realized with a sinking feeling that he was looking at her dinner. I can't take your food, he protested. You can and you will. Her voice was firm. You need it more than I do right now. Alistair looked down at the bowl. Soup, she'd called it. But he could see it was mostly hot water with a few herbs and perhaps a potato if he was lucky. This woman was starving, and she was giving him her last meal. At least share it with me, he said. I already ate, she lied, and they both knew it was a lie. Alistair ate slowly, making the meager soup last, trying not to think about how hungry she must be. Around them, the storm raged, wind howling through gaps in the walls that no amount of patching could fully seal. Snow was melting through a leak in the roof, dripping steadily into a bucket in the corner. His eyes caught on a photograph above the mantel. A young soldier in uniform, handsome and proud, with a black ribbon draped across one corner of the frame. Your husband, he asked gently. My son. The woman's voice was flat, emotionless in the way of someone who'd cried all their tears long ago. He died serving the crown 3 years ago. Alistair felt something twist in his chest. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. She stared at the fire, at her burning furniture. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't pay the rent or fix the roof or fill the cellar with food for winter. Is there no one to help you? Family? The parish? I'm helping myself. Her chin lifted with pride. I've survived this long on my own. I'll survive the rest. But she wouldn't, Alistair thought, looking around the cabin. She was burning her furniture because she'd run out of firewood. Her food supplies were nearly gone. The roof was failing. One more hard storm, one more brutal cold snap, and this woman would freeze to death alone in this cabin. And she'd do it with her head held high, too proud to beg for help. You can take my bed, the woman said, interrupting his thoughts. I'll sit by the fire. Absolutely not. Alistair set down his empty bowl. I'll sleep on the floor. You need proper rest. They argued about it for several minutes, but Alistair was stubborn and she was exhausted. Finally, she retreated to her narrow bed, pulling thin blankets around herself. Alistair stretched out on the hard floor near the fire, using his torn coat as a pillow. The flames were dying, the last of the chair legs turning to ash. Soon there would be no more fuel, and the cold would creep back in. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and the woman's quiet breathing and the steady drip of melting snow into the bucket. Planning. By the time dawn broke, Duke Alistair Blackwood knew exactly what he was going to do. If you love a story where the underdog shows the elite what true strength looks like, hit that like button right now and subscribe to join our community of story lovers. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this scandalous transformation. 2. Morning arrived grey and cold, the storm finally exhausted. Alistair woke to find the woman, Elena. He'd learned her name in the night when she'd woken from a nightmare calling for her son, already awake, rekindling the fire with scraps of wood she must have scavenged. Your people will be looking for you, she said without preamble. The storm's cleared enough for travel. How do you know I have people? Alistair asked, sitting up and wincing at the stiffness in his back. Elena gave him a look that suggested he was being deliberately dense. Your coat, before it got torn, was worth more than this entire cabin. Your accent is educated. Your hands have never done a day of hard labor. She shrugged. Your quality. Quality always has people. Alistair looked down at his hands. She wasn't wrong. They were smooth, uncalloused, the hands of a man who'd never needed to work for his survival. Let me pay you, he said, reaching into his inner pocket. His coin purse was still there, miraculously intact despite the crash. He pulled out several gold coins. For the shelter. The food. Elena's expression hardened. Put that away. It's only fair. I don't sell my hospitality. Her voice was ice. You were cold. I gave you warmth. You were hungry. I gave you food. That's what decent people do. They don't put a price on basic human kindness. But you need. What I need, Elena interrupted, her pride blazing like the dying fire, is to make it through this winter with my dignity intact. I won't take charity, and I won't sell what should be given freely. Keep your gold, my lord. I'm not for sale. She said my lord like it was a curse, and Alistair realized she'd known what he was all along. She just hadn't cared. In the distance, he heard what he'd been waiting for. Voices. His rescue team, finally finding the crashed carriage and tracking his footsteps through the snow. Your Grace. Thomas, his driver, appeared at the cabin door, relief flooding his weathered face. Thank God. We thought. I'm fine, Alistair said, standing and brushing off his ruined clothes. Just cold and bruised. He turned to Elena, who was watching the scene with something like resignation. She'd gone back to being invisible in her own home, the way the poor learned to be around the wealthy. Thank you for your kindness, Alistair said formally. I won't forget it. Elena nodded once, her expression neutral. She clearly expected never to see him again, to become just another memory of a hard winter night. Alistair left without another word, following his men back through the snow to where they'd brought a new carriage. He climbed inside, accepted the heavy furs they wrapped around him, and sat in silence as they began the journey back to Blackwood Hall. Your Grace, Thomas ventured after a while, forgive me, but you seem troubled. Tell me about the Soldiers' Aid Program, Alistair said abruptly. The one for families of men who died in service. I believe there is a pension system, Your Grace, but it's notoriously difficult to navigate. Many widows never receive what they're owed. Find out why. Alistair's voice was steel. And fix it. Use whatever resources are necessary. Yes, Your Grace. But Alistair was already thinking beyond the general problem to one specific solution. To a woman too proud to accept charity, burning her furniture to survive. To a son who died serving his country, leaving his mother alone in a failing cabin. To the photograph above the mantel, and the face he'd recognized in it. Because Alistair Blackwood had seen that young soldier before. Not in a photograph, but on a battlefield 6 years ago, when a shell had exploded near Alistair's position and a young private had thrown himself between the Duke and the blast. The private had survived, barely. Alistair had made sure he received the best medical care available. They'd spoken briefly in the hospital, and the young man had told him about his mother, about the cabin in the Highlands where she lived alone. Alistair had meant to follow up, to ensure the family was taken care of. But wars ended and life moved on and he'd lost track of one brave soldier among thousands. Until now. Thomas, Alistair said quietly, I need you to arrange something for me. Something large. And I need it done quietly. Of course, Your Grace. What do you need? Alistair told him. And as he spoke, he watched Thomas's eyes widen with understanding and perhaps a little awe. Your Grace, Thomas said when he finished, that's incredibly generous. It's the bare minimum, Alistair corrected. Her son saved my life. The least I can do is ensure she survives the winter. But even as he said it, he knew it was more than debt. Something about Elena's fierce pride, her stubborn dignity in the face of crushing poverty, had gotten under his skin. She'd given him her last meal. Offered her bed to a stranger. Refused payment because hospitality shouldn't have a price. In a world of social climbers and fortune hunters, of people who saw him as a title first and a man second, Elena had seen only another human being who needed help. And that, Alistair thought as the carriage carried him away from the failing cabin, was worth more than all the gold in his treasury. 3 days. That's how long Thomas said it would take to arrange everything. 3 days for Elena to believe she'd never see the strange traveller again. 3 days before Alistair Blackwood showed her what a duke could do when he decided to repay a debt. 3. Elena woke on the 4th morning after the storm to the sound of her stomach growling. She'd been rationing her food carefully, making the last of her supplies stretch as far as possible. The potato soup she'd given the traveller had been most of what she had left. Now there was nothing but some dried herbs and half a loaf of bread that was more mold than flour. She should be looking for work in the village, but the snow was still deep and she was so weak from hunger that the walk felt impossible. Instead, she did what she'd been doing for weeks. She broke off another piece of her table and fed it to the fire. The furniture that had filled this cabin when her son was alive was nearly gone now. She'd burned his chair first, then hers, then the small bookshelf, then the legs of the table. Soon she'd start on the bed frame, and after that. Elena didn't let herself think about after that. She was stirring her hot water, she couldn't even call it tea anymore, there were no tea leaves left when she heard it. Voices. Many voices. And the unmistakable sound of heavy wagons. Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. Wagons meant only one thing. The landlord had finally decided to evict her. She was behind on rent, had been for months, and her son's pension had never arrived despite her dozens of letters to the War Office. She opened the door, preparing to defend her home with whatever dignity she had left. What she saw made no sense. The clearing in front of her cabin was filled with activity. 4 massive wagons sat in the snow, already half unloaded. Men swarmed everywhere, carrying crates and lumber, directing operations with military precision. And at the center of it all stood a man in simple worker's clothes, gesturing and shouting orders. "What's happening?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking. "Who sent you?" The man in charge turned, and Elena recognized him immediately. The driver from the carriage, the one who'd come to collect the traveler. "Thomas," he introduced himself with a respectful nod. "We're here under orders from the Crown's landlord." "I don't understand." Elena looked around at the chaos. "Orders to do what?" "Evict me." "Evict you?" Thomas looked genuinely shocked. "No, madam. Orders to make this cabin livable before the next storm hits." As he spoke, men began unloading the wagons. Elena watched in stunned disbelief as they carried past her. Seasoned oak firewood. Not a few logs, but enough to fill the entire side of her cabin. Years' worth of firewood, dry and ready to burn. Crates of preserved food. Jams, pickles, dried meat, flour, sugar, tea. Real tea, the expensive kind she hadn't tasted since before the war. Thick thermal insulation. The modern kind that wealthy estates used, that cost more than Elena had earned in her entire life. "Stop," Elena managed, but her voice was too weak. I can't pay for this." "It's already paid for," Thomas said gently. "We're just following orders, madam. Making deliveries." For the next week, Elena's cabin became a hive of activity that both overwhelmed and terrified her. The workers arrived at dawn and left at dusk. They didn't ask permission. They didn't explain themselves. They just worked with an efficiency that suggested military training. The roof was stripped down to the beams and rebuilt properly, with real slate tiles that wouldn't leak. The walls were reinforced and insulated, gaps sealed with modern materials. A beautiful cast-iron wood-burning stove was installed where her pathetic fireplace had been, with proper venting and heat distribution. The windows were replaced with new glass. The floor was reinforced and covered with warm rugs. The furniture she'd burned was replaced with solid, beautiful pieces that looked like they'd come from an estate sale. And through it all, more supplies arrived. The cellar she'd thought would be empty all winter was filled to bursting with enough food to last 3 winters. Not just basics, but luxuries. Coffee. Chocolate. Spices she hadn't seen in years. Elena tried to protest. Tried to send it all back. But Thomas just smiled and said, "Orders, madam. We're just following orders." On the 7th day, when the work was finally complete, Elena stood in the doorway of what had been a failing cabin and was now a proper cottage. It was warm. Actually warm, heat radiating from the new stove. The walls no longer leaked cold air. The roof no longer dripped melted snow. There was food in her cellar and wood stacked by her door and everything she needed to not just survive but actually live. She wanted to cry. She wanted to rage. She wanted to know who had done this and why, Because charity this massive came with strings attached, and Elena knew better than to trust gifts from the wealthy. Thomas approached her as his men were packing up to leave. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a package from one of the wagons. Inside was the most beautiful coat Elena had ever seen. Heavy wool, properly lined, with brass buttons and a fur collar. The kind of coat that could keep someone warm through the worst Highland winter. And in the pocket, a letter. Elena's hands shook as she unfolded it. "Dear Mrs. Blackwood, you will not remember me, but 6 years ago, your son saved my life. I was serving as a commissioned officer during the war when my position came under heavy fire. A shell landed near me, and I would have died if not for the bravery of a young private who threw himself between me and the blast. That private was your son, James. He survived the blast, barely, and I ensured he received the best medical care available. We spoke in the hospital, and he told me about you, about the cabin in the Highlands where you lived alone. He was so proud of you, Mrs. Blackwood. Proud of your strength, your independence, your refusal to be broken by hardship. I meant to follow up, to ensure his family was taken care of. But I failed in that duty, and for that failure, I am deeply sorry. When fate brought me to your door during the storm, I did not recognize you at first. But when I saw your son's photograph, I knew immediately who you were. You saved my life that night, Mrs. Blackwood. You gave me shelter and warmth and the last of your food, expecting nothing in return. You refused payment because, as you said, decent people don't put a price on basic human kindness. Your son saved my life once. You saved it again. And I am not a man who forgets his debts. What I have done is not charity. It is not pity. It is the bare minimum of what I owe to the family of the man who gave me a future. Please accept these improvements as a small token of my gratitude. Your son would want to know you were safe and warm. I hope I have honored his memory in some small way. With deepest respect. Alistair Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood." Elena read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. The traveller had been the Duke. The man her son had saved. And he'd come back, not with empty platitudes or token gifts, but with this. With survival. With dignity. With the means to actually live instead of just existing. She stood in her warm cottage, surrounded by supplies that would last her through winter and beyond, and for the first time in 3 years, Elena allowed herself to hope. 4. Elena spent the next week getting used to her transformed cottage. It felt strange, almost wrong, to be warm. To have food in her belly and fuel for her fire and walls that didn't leak cold air. She kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream, that she was back in the failing cabin burning her furniture to survive. But every morning, the cottage was still there. Still warm. Still impossibly generous. She tried to write a thank you letter to the Duke but found herself staring at blank paper for hours. What did you say to someone who'd essentially saved your life? How did you thank a man who'd given you back your dignity? She was still struggling with the letter when she heard a carriage approaching. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. Was it the Duke? Had he come to collect on whatever debt she now owed him? Because this kind of generosity always came with strings attached. She knew that. But when she opened the door, it wasn't a formal carriage with the Blackwood crest. It was a simple cart, and driving it was the Duke himself, dressed in plain clothes and carrying a basket. "Your Grace," Elena managed, dropping into an awkward curtsy. "Please don't." Alistair climbed down from the cart, the basket balanced easily in one arm. "I'm not here as a duke. I'm here as the man whose life your son saved." He looked different without his fine clothes. Younger, less intimidating. His eyes were kind as they swept over the cottage, taking in the repairs. "Everything is satisfactory?" he asked. "Satisfactory?" Elena felt hysterical laughter bubble up. "Your Grace, you've given me more than satisfactory. You've given me survival." "No." Alistair's voice was firm. "I've given you what you deserve. What your son's sacrifice earned. Nothing more." He held up the basket. "I brought lunch." I thought perhaps we could eat together, and you could tell me about James. I only knew him briefly, and I'd like to know more about the man who saved my life." Elena should have said no. Should have kept the proper distance between a duke and a widow. But she was so tired of being alone, and he was the only person in 3 years who'd looked at her with something other than pity. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. They ate at her new table, food that Alistair had brought and Elena had prepared. Good food, simple but hearty. And as they ate, Elena told him about James. About the boy who'd loved the Highlands, who'd climbed every hill and explored every valley. About the young man who'd enlisted because he believed in serving something greater than himself. About the letters he'd sent from the war, full of hope and homesickness and fierce love for his mother. "He wrote about you once," Alistair said quietly. "After the incident. He said his mother had taught him that protecting others was the highest calling. That strength meant nothing if you didn't use it to help those who couldn't help themselves." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "He was a better person than I ever was. He learned it somewhere." Alistair reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You raised a hero, Elena. That's not a small thing." They talked for hours, until the sun began to set and Alistair reluctantly stood to leave. "Before I go," he said, reaching into his coat. "There's one more thing." He pulled out a document, official and sealed. Elena recognized it immediately as a property deed. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "This valley," Alistair said, "and all the land for 5 miles in every direction. I've purchased it and placed it in your name." Elena stared at him. "You've what?" "The land is yours, Elena. Completely. No rent, no landlord, no one who can ever threaten to evict you or take your home." Alistair set the deed on the table. "You own this valley. You're not just surviving here anymore. You're thriving. And no one can take that away from you. I can't accept." "Yes, you can." Alistair's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't charity, Elena. This is recognition. Your son saved my life. You saved my life. This is me ensuring that the family of the man who gave me a future has a future of their own." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'd like to visit again, if you'll permit it. Perhaps next Sunday for tea?" Elena found herself nodding, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Alistair smiled, and for the first time since James died, Elena felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Hope. And perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something more. 5. The scandal, when it broke, was magnificent. The Duke of Blackwood, one of Scotland's wealthiest and most eligible bachelors, had given an entire valley to a common widow. He visited her every Sunday. They took tea together like equals. London society was apoplectic with gossip. What did it mean? Was she his mistress? His charity project? Some bizarre social experiment? Alistair and Elena couldn't have cared less. They spent their Sundays talking, learning each other's stories. Elena told him about the years of hardship, the struggle to survive after James died. Alistair told her about the war, the weight of his title, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw his wealth and status. "You see me," he said one Sunday, 6 months after their first meeting. "Not the Duke, not the title. Just me." "You see me too," Elena replied. "Not the poor widow, not the object of pity. Just me." It was, they both realized, the beginning of something neither had expected. Love grew slowly between them, built on mutual respect and shared loss and the recognition of strength in each other. Alistair courted Elena properly, with all the patience and care she deserved. He brought her books from his library. She taught him about the Highlands, about the plants that grew wild and the animals that thrived in the harsh climate. They walked through the valley that was now hers, making plans for the future. "I want to build something here," Elena said one day. "Not just for me, but for others. A place where widows of soldiers can come, where they can have safety and dignity and a chance to rebuild their lives." Alistair looked at her with such pride it took her breath away. "Then let's build it together." The Blackwood Sanctuary opened 2 years later. It wasn't just a cottage anymore, but a proper estate. Multiple buildings, each one designed to house families who needed shelter. Gardens where women could grow food. Workshops where they could learn trades. A school for their children. And at the heart of it all, the original cottage. Preserved exactly as it had been after the renovations, a reminder of where it all started. Elena managed the sanctuary with fierce dedication, her natural strength and dignity inspiring every woman who came through their doors. She knew what it was like to be alone and afraid and burning your furniture to survive. She knew how to help them find their way back to hope. Alistair funded it all, but more importantly, he supported Elena. Not as a patron or a benefactor, but as an equal partner in their mission. They married quietly, 3 years after that first storm-tossed night. No grand ceremony, no society spectacle. Just a simple service in the cottage chapel, witnessed by the women of the sanctuary and Alistair's most trusted staff. Elena Blackwood, the woman who'd started as a widow burning her furniture to survive, became the Duchess of Blackwood. And she wore her title not with pride but with purpose, using it to help others who needed the same chance she'd been given. Every Sunday, without fail, Alistair would arrive at the cottage with tea. The finest tea, served in the chipped cup Elena had given him that first night. She'd kept it, despite having access to the finest china in Scotland, because some things were too precious to replace. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked him one Sunday, years into their marriage. "Tying yourself to a poor widow instead of marrying some society beauty?" Alistair looked at her, his wife, the woman who'd saved his life twice over and then given him purpose beyond wealth and titles. "Every day," he said solemnly, then smiled at her shocked expression. "Every day, I regret that it took a blizzard and a carriage crash for me to find you. I should have found you sooner." He pulled her into his arms, and Elena let herself be held by this man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up rather than walk away. "You gave me tea and shelter when I had nothing to offer you," Alistair murmured against her hair. "You refused my gold because hospitality shouldn't have a price. You showed me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with how you treat people when you have nothing to gain." "You gave me back my life," Elena replied. "Not just survival, but actual living. Purpose. Hope. Love." They stood together in the cottage that had become a sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of what compassion could build. Outside, women who'd been where Elena had been desperate, alone, forgotten, were laughing and working and raising their children in safety. All because a duke had seen a widow living alone in an old snow cabin. All because he'd done what amazed everyone. Not grand gestures or performative charity. Just simple, profound kindness. The recognition that every life had value, that debt was more than gold, that sometimes the greatest thing a person with power could do was use it to help those without. "I love you," Alistair said simply. "I love you too," Elena replied. "My impossible, generous, ridiculous Duke." "Your Duke," he corrected. "Always and only yours." And every Sunday for the rest of their lives, they had tea together in that cottage. In the place where it all began. Where a storm brought them together and kindness made them family. The scandal never quite died down. Society never quite knew what to make of the Duke who'd married a widow and turned her cabin into a sanctuary. But Alistair and Elena stopped caring what society thought long before they stopped making a difference in the world. Because some stories aren't about scandal or spectacle. Some stories are about tea in a chipped cup, warmth in a cold storm, and the quiet miracle of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. Those are the stories that change lives. Those are the stories worth telling. The end.